The alien queen took a human consort for politics, and half her empire laughed before supper. By sunrise, the laughing had stopped. By the end of the season, governors were losing titles, generals were rewriting doctrine, palace servants were speaking the queen's name without fear. And historians later tried to sand the story smooth, saying Queen Thessalyra had planned everything. But the truth was uglier and more human. She chose him because she needed votes in the Assembly of Moons. Because trade routes were collapsing, because border fleets were muttering, because rival houses had started whispering that her bloodline was too cold to survive another generation, and because the human named Julian Cross came with a treaty, a grain corridor, an escort fleet, and a face calm enough to walk through predators without pretending he belonged, she meant to use him, he noticed immediately, and married her anyway. The Empire of Verithus was old enough to confuse age with wisdom. Its towers rose like blades from oceans of silver mist. Its nobles wore inheritance like armor, and its people had spent so long kneeling before ceremonial perfection that many no longer remembered government was supposed to help them live. Queen Thessalyra knew all this with the bitterness of a ruler raised inside a machine older than mercy. She had inherited the throne at 29 after her mother died in the middle of a famine hearing. Smiling for the cameras while ministers lied about grain numbers, since then, she had spent 4 years wrestling an empire that preferred beautiful stagnation to painful repair. Outer provinces starved while central palaces hosted moon festivals. The military purchased prestige cruisers while border settlements begged for filters. And every reform she attempted returned to her sliced open by committees, traditions, hereditary privileges, and courtiers who mistook delay for sophistication. Then came the Terran Compact, blunt, expanding, impossible to ignore. Humans had moved into the broken trade lanes beyond Verithus and done what humans always did when civilization cracked. They built ugly, efficient things that worked. Julian Cross was the Compact's envoy. Though envoy was only the clean version of his history, before diplomacy, he had been a logistics commander. Before that, a disaster coordinator. Before that, the son of 2 maintenance workers on a spinninger station that failed so often its children. Learned emergency procedure before reading. He arrived in the capital with no jeweled retinue. Only a dark, formal coat, a scar through one eyebrow, and eyes that looked at imperial marble the way a mechanic looked at overheating machinery. The first thing he said to Thessalyra in private was not flattery, but "Your Majesty. Your officials are hiding a transport collapse, and at least 2 of them think I am too foreign to notice." She should have had him removed for that tone. Instead, she asked, "Did you notice anyone else?" He answered, "Yes. The ones frightened enough to be useful." The proposal came together like a weapon built under pressure. The human compact wanted access to the inner trade arcs. Thessalyra needed compact food networks to keep 3 rim sectors from revolt. The Assembly of Moons needed a public symbol large enough to believe they were participating in history instead of being cornered into survival. So the Queen offered what no one expected. A political consort bond. Not love. Not surrender. A dynastic contract designed to fuse markets, fleets, and legitimacy in a single stroke. The court lost its mind exactly as predicted. The elder houses called it contamination. The military faction called it desperation. The temple analysts called it an omen with paperwork. And through all of it, Julian stood beside the diplomatic table with the expression of a man waiting for a storm to decide whether it would flood or pass. Thessalyra studied him while the assembly screamed. He did not grin when nobles insulted him, did not puff himself up when humans in the gallery began smiling. He only looked attentive, like someone already mapping which support beams would crack first. Later, in the sealed chamber beneath the Hall of Suns, she asked the question every ruler asks when forced into intimacy by necessity. "What do you really want, Julian?" Unfastened one glove finger by finger, then said, "Stability functioning ports. Fewer children eating ration paste in provinces your ministers describe as statistically acceptable, and a chance to prove to my government that partnership costs less than scavenging the ruins after empires fail." Thessalyra narrowed her eyes. "That sounds noble." He gave the slightest hint of a smile. "No, Majesty. Noble would be saying, I came here to admire you. This is logistics. People die when proud systems stop moving. She should have disliked him for reducing her civilization to movement tables and delivery failures. Instead, something colder and more useful settled in her chest. Trust, not complete, never foolish, but enough. The bond was signed before dusk. The public ceremony glittered like sacrilege. And when the Queen placed the consort mark against Julian's wrist, the cameras captured exactly what the Empire feared most. Not romance, but calm. By nightfall, the palace had turned predatory. Every corridor whisper carried teeth. Servants were bribed, guards reassigned. Family branches began inviting one another to private dinners that meant strategy rather than celebration. Because a human consort for politics was one thing, an effective human consort was another. In Thessalyra, new danger had sharpened the moment she saw how quickly Julian adapted to ceremonial gravity. He learned names faster than seasoned ministers, read status cues without becoming captive to them, and possessed a frontier habit none of the nobles understood until it was too late. He treated staff as information networks instead of furniture. Within 48 hours, he knew which kitchen routes fed the undercity clinics, which lift shafts were reserved for titled bloodlines, which water districts had been marked repaired only on paper, which admiral's nephew controlled spare parts contracts, and which smiling controller had been selling emergency grain futures during the famine cycle. He gathered details the way stars gather matter, silently, until the weight became impossible to ignore. Thessalyra found him at second bell, standing on a service balcony overlooking the worker transit rings. No crown hall, no moon garden, just steel rails, maintenance lights, and thousands of shift workers moving below like the bloodstream of the city. I was told consorts preferred the East Observatory, she said. Julian leaned on the rail as if he had never feared seeming informal near power. The observatory shows what your empire wants to look at. This shows what keeps it alive. The answer irritated her because it was true. You speak often as though Verithius is broken beyond repair, she said. Julian shook his head. No, broken things are simpler. Yours still functions just well enough for the wrong people to call collapse tradition. Then he added, dramatic line for the poet's majesty. Your empire is dying beautifully, and someone needs to make it ugly enough to survive. She laughed, despite herself. That was the first moment she stopped seeing him as an instrument and started seeing him as a threat much more dangerous to old systems. A competent outsider with permission to stand near the throne? Asterisk, the first blow he struck was not against the nobles, but against distance. 4 days into the bond, Julian requested access to the emergency petition archive, a dead institution housed under glass and dust. Once meant to let provincial citizens appeal directly to the throne during breakdowns of local governance, for a century it had been decorative, because petitions were filtered, delayed, translated into polite abstractions, then buried under etiquette. Thessalyra granted him access out of curiosity and spite, expecting a symbolic gesture. Instead, he sealed himself in the archive for 12 hours with junior data clerks, compact analysts, and a portable logistics board. When he emerged, he requested an unscheduled assembly session, and in front of the entire chamber, he projected 200 years of ignored appeals into the vaulted air. Mining towns asking for pressure dome repairs, river colonies begging for medical spore filters, cargo unions warning of piracy corridors that later became battle zones, school districts reporting food contamination months before provincial famines, names, dates, signatures, deaths, and beneath each one, the court notation that had smothered action. Deferred, reviewed, deemed local, pending verification. No ceremonial speech could survive against that graveyard of polite abandonment. The nobles called it manipulation, Julian called it filing. One duchess accused him of weaponizing suffering for influence. Julian replied, "No, Duchess, your ancestors weaponized distance." I just removed the curtain, the chamber erupted, which was precisely what he wanted, because while they screamed, Thessalyra watched the public feed counters climbing across the empire, people in worker districts, ferry stations, provincial barracks, climate towers. all seeing their own history acknowledged in imperial air for the first time. Something subtle and irreversible moved that day. The Queen's authority, long trapped inside ritual, began flowing toward function, and because Julian had done the exposing instead of her, the houses could not accuse her of attacking tradition out of personal grievance. They attacked him instead, which he seemed to regard as proof of progress. Then the fleet tried to humiliate him, and failed so spectacularly, it became legend. Lord Marshal Saravane, commander of the Azure Armadas, tall, jeweled, adored by the high-caste press, invited the new human consort to a readiness review over the Northern Sea. Everyone knew it was a trap. The Marshal intended to bury Julian under layers of doctrine and hereditary officer culture, then feed the footage to the networks as evidence that humans understood freight and salvage, but not imperial war. Thessalyra attended because she was not about to let her consort walk blind into a staged dissection. The flagship glittered, the officers glittered, the sea below glittered, everything on Varethus glittered when it wanted to hide rot. Saravane walked Julian through immaculate decks and polished launch bays while speaking in that smooth military tone that meant every sentence was territorial marking. Finally, he gestured toward the tactical well and asked, perhaps the consort would care to comment on imperial readiness. Thessalyra waited for Julian to offer a diplomatic phrase. Instead, he stepped to the display, asked for procurement overlays, fuel routing maps, and maintenance hours, then spent 30 seconds reading silence into the room. This squadron cannot fight a sustained campaign beyond 9 days, he said. Saravane's smile hardened. You're mistaken. Julian continued, as if interruption were weather. Your replacement parts are being cycled through prestige depots for ceremonial inspection before distribution. Your outer escort frigates are scavenging engine seals from retired hulls. 1 in 5 pilots on the frontier rotation is logging false simulator hours, because training fuel allotments were diverted to this parade group. And your glorious new interceptors overheat in dust-rich atmospheres, because someone optimized them for launch footage instead of combat conditions. No one breathed. The human consort turned from the display and finished with surgical calm. For your admirers, Marshal, this fleet has excellent posture and terrible knees. Officers realized an outsider had said aloud what they had muttered in wardrooms for years. Saravane demanded proof. Julian had already sent it to the tactical board. Every claim sourced and ugly. Within a week, the Fleet Procurement Ministry was under audit. 3 contractors fled system, 2 admirals retired suddenly for health reasons. And every junior officer in the Empire learned the human consort could read a supply chain like a confession. Predictably, reform bred enemies faster than it bred results. And by the 2nd month, Thessalyra's marriage had turned from scandal to battleground. The High Temple questioned whether a bonded human could influence succession law. The Assembly tried to box Julian into ceremonial duties only. And 3 outer governors openly delayed grain shipments just to test whether the throne still had teeth. Thessalyra prepared the usual answer. Sanctions, arrests, a military demonstration. Julian asked for 12 days and access to the communication lattice. She gave both with the private suspicion that he was about to do something either brilliant or unforgivable. He did both. Instead of threatening the governors through official channels, he bypassed them and opened direct emergency contracts with their port labor unions, agricultural co-ops, dock engineers, med transport crews, and militia quartermasters. He paid fair rates, guaranteed fuel, and publicly posted delivery metrics visible to every citizen in the affected sectors. Suddenly, governors who had ruled through delay discovered the empire moving around them. Food landed without their blessing. Repair ships docked by worker vote. Local news streams compared promised schedules against actual deliveries in real time. And the illusion that titled intermediaries were necessary began to bleed out in public. The governors panicked, accused the consort of inciting class disorder. Julian responded in the assembly with a line people repeated for years. If your authority cannot survive competent work, it was never authority, only traffic. Thessalyra watched the chamber freeze, then shift, because there it was again. The human refusal to worship a process that no longer served survival Results followed with humiliating speed. Food riots fell, medical stock stabilized. Pirate losses along the Pelarch dropped by half once the dock crews trusted they would actually be paid for emergency reroutes. And for the first time in generations, the throne was spoken of in the same sentence as delivery, rather than pageantry. Citizens in the lower districts began hanging crude silver and blue ribbons from transit rails. Queen and consort colors together, not because they adored romance, but because things were finally arriving on time. The Thessalyra found that far more dangerous than devotion. Devotion could be manipulated, competence could spread. And then came the assassination attempt, because dying systems always reach for murder when embarrassment stops working. It happened during the Rain Court procession. The one ceremony Thessalyra hated more than coronation. An outdoor spectacle on suspended crystal bridges above the storm reservoirs. Julian had argued against attending, not from fear, but because he believed ceremonies should be cancelled when food distribution software was being rebuilt across 6 sectors. Thessalyra made him come anyway, because if they hid now, the houses would smell weakness for years. The first shot did not target the queen. It targeted the bridge stabilizers, a smart move. The crystal span beneath the procession screamed, cracked, and dropped half a meter in a spray of rain and shattered light. Courtiers panicked instantly. Guards drew weapons at shadows. And somewhere in the choir towers, a second sniper fired toward the Thessalyra's heart. Julian hit her before the guard field did, driving her down so hard her shoulder slammed the wet crystal. The shot burned through the air where her throat had been, then everything accelerated. One bridge section collapsing, nobles sliding, storm sirens waking across the district, Julian rolling to one knee with a palace guard's sidearm. Putting 2 precise shots into the far tower glass, not killing the sniper, breaking visibility, buying seconds, always buying seconds. Thessalyra rose with fury bright and cold. She saw the real design then, not only to kill her, but to make it public and chaotic, the perfect image of a throne losing control under foreign influence. Julian caught the same pattern a heartbeat sooner. The Western support line? He snapped too late. The third explosion tore the side span loose. A section of ceremonial bridge peeled away over open storm space, taking 12 nobles and 2 guards with it. Thessalyra had one terrified second to choose between pursuing the shooters and stabilizing the falling bridge segment. She chose the people because queens were allowed exactly one soul, and she intended to keep hers. Julian was already moving. He sprinted the fractured line toward the secondary stabilizer node while rain hammered. The world silver and the bridge screamed under stress. Thessalyra never saw the rest cleanly, only pieces. Julian dropping to the maintenance hatch, forcing it with bleeding fingers, engineers shouting impossible numbers, guards firing into tower windows. Then Julian manually rerouting the bridge load through a service spine no ceremonial architect had considered worth displaying. Human solution, ugly, external, functional. The falling section jolted, swung, stopped. All 12 nobles and both guards hanging alive in emergency harness webbing over the storm basin. The capital watched the rescue live, watched the queen organize extraction under fire, watched the human consort disappear waist-deep into maintenance guts to keep the span from tearing loose again. Watched beauty fail and utility save it. By dusk, the official investigation was already naming 3 aristocratic houses. But the public had moved on to a simpler truth. When the pretty bridge broke, the human knew where the real structure was. After that, the empire changed faster than anyone at court could control. Not because Julian took power in some dramatic coup, he never tried, but because he kept translating royal will into systems ordinary people could feel. Thessalyra signed what he built, defended what he exposed, sharpened what he lacked. And together, they became something the old order had no language for, a throne that learned. He opened provincial audit schools staffed by merit recruits instead of bloodline appointees. She backed them with crown law. He forced fleet readiness reports into public review bans. She attached promotions to honesty instead of polish. He redesigned famine response as automatic trigger logistics. She made any governor who delayed activation legally liable for preventable deaths. He created a rotating worker council inside the capital. Everyone mocked it until its recommendations cut transit waste by 20% in 1 quarter. She televised the results and let the numbers insult the nobles for her. Still, the deepest change was harder to measure. He had made truth less decorative. In a civilization addicted to elegant falsehood that bordered on revolution, there were sabotage attempts, smear campaigns, whisper pieces about human contamination of court values. There were nights Thessalyra came to his strategy rooms furious enough to cut law in half. And nights Julian sat with housing planners until dawn because he could not stand one more report, written in euphemism over dead children. Somewhere inside all that work, politics developed a pulse. Thessalyra learned he was funniest when exhausted. Julian learned the queen removed her crown, the second doors sealed, because it gave her headaches. She discovered he hated orchestral diplomacy, but loved machine shops. He discovered she had memorized crop density maps as a girl because it was the only way to understand where food vanished between harvest and ceremony. They argued in clipped tones that made aides flee hallways. Then returned the next day, sharper instead of broken. Affection arrived like reform had. Through function first, trust before softness. Loyalty before confession, the Empire noticed long before either of them admitted it. Because there is a difference between a staged bond and two people who have survived the same fires and started reaching for the same future. The final test came not from the houses, but from the edge, where all empires learn whether their values are real. A solar shear event tore across the outer relay spine during the 6th month of the bond, frying navigational nodes, crippling atmosphere processors on 4 colony moons, and trapping 80,000 civilians in failing domes with 2 days of air margin. Under the old Varethus, the response would have drowned in hierarchy, provincial petitions, fleet rank disputes, ceremonial authorizations, and everyone important explaining procedure while remote people suffocated beautifully. Instead, Thessalyra triggered the new emergency protocols. Julian had designed, and the old court had mocked as inelegantly automatic. Local engineers received direct authority. Freight captains got immediate fuel guarantees. Naval escorts were reassigned by readiness rather than family pressure. Worker councils opened spare parts reserves without waiting for hereditary signatures. And the queen went live across the empire beside her human consort. Not in regalia, but in command black, telling every citizen exactly what had failed, what was moving, and who would answer for delay. It was the least graceful broadcast in dynastic memory, and the most trusted ships launched within minutes. Repair clusters reached the first moon in 11 hours. The last dome stabilized with 9 minutes of breathable atmosphere remaining. 80,000 lived. Afterward, the metrics spread everywhere. Compare with prior crises. Compare the death curves. Compare the transit delays. Compare the lies. Compare the cost of pride. There was no hiding from it anymore. The human consort had not softened the empire, had not charmed it, had not conquered it. He had forced it to remember that governments exist to keep people alive, and once enough citizens tasted that truth, the old order never really recovered years later. Poets would ruin the story on purpose. They would say the alien queen took a human consort for politics and found love, which was true in the shallowest possible sense and therefore insufficient. What she found was rarer. A man from a young, brutal species that still remembered survival was a group project. A man who looked at palaces and saw maintenance failures. Looked at hierarchy and asked whether it delivered anything worth the kneeling. Looked at power and treated it not as inheritance, but as a tool that should justify its own weight every day. Julian Cross changed the empire because he had not been trained to revere its excuses. And because Thessalyra, to her everlasting credit, was wise enough to let herself be changed beside it. The old nobles never forgave him. The border worlds never forgot him. And somewhere in the capital, there is still a service balcony where the queen and her consort once stood after midnight, looking down at the movement that kept civilization alive. If you ask the people of Varethus when their empire truly began to heal, they will not tell you the date of the marriage treaty, or the assembly vote, or the first reform law. They will tell you it began the moment a queen used a human for politics and accidentally chose the first person in her world, honest enough to save it from itself.